Some invitations are not meant to be accepted. They are meant to wound. They are folded with cruel hands, sealed with cold wax, and delivered with the kind of smile that holds a blade beneath it. They arrive dressed as opportunity, smelling of expensive perfume, written in golden ink, and they are traps, every single one. Elara Voss received hers on a Tuesday. It landed at her feet in the mud of Threadneedle Alley, not handed to her, not carried to her door, but dropped. Dropped the way you drop something you consider garbage. Dropped from the white-gloved fingers of Lady Genevieve Ashworth, who stood in her sky-blue gown above Elara's bent form and laughed with every one of her perfectly painted teeth showing. "Consider it charity," Lady Genevieve said. "A little seamstress, attending the Grand Duke's birthday ball. What a delightful little story for everyone to laugh about." Her companions tittered behind their fans. The carriage horses shifted. A passing merchant pretended not to hear. Aara straightened slowly. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She reached down, picked up that gold-embossed card, tucked it beneath her patched wool coat, and held Lady Genevieve's eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds. The length of time it takes to make a decision that changes everything. She was going to that ball. Not because she was invited, but because she had something to say, and this was the stage on which she would say it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Elara Voss had been poor her entire life, but she had never once been small. There is a difference, and most people never learn it. Poor is a number, a circumstance, the weight of what your pockets hold or don't hold. Small is what happens to your spirit when you let the world decide your worth. Elara's pockets had always been nearly empty. Her spirit had never once bowed. She lived in a single room above the cobbler's shop on Threadneedle Alley, in the soot-darkened quarter of Highgate, where chimneys coughed black smoke from before dawn, and women aged fast from the cold. Her window looked down over the narrow street, where fish sellers argued with flower girls, where barefoot children darted between cartwheels, where the smell of yesterday's bread mixed with today's mud. She was a seamstress. She repaired what the wealthy discarded hems torn at parties, gloves worn through at the thumb, coat collars frayed from too much living. They sent their broken things to Aara, and she made them whole again. They never sent a thank you. They rarely sent the full payment. She had deep, blue eyes that people sometimes stopped to stare at, not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because there was something in them that made people feel they were being read, not looked at. Read, like she could see the page behind your face. Her dark hair was always pinned back while she worked, but even pinned it held a certain dignity, coiled at the nape of her neck with the careful precision of a woman who understood that how you carry yourself is the only thing poverty cannot take. She was 24 years old. She had been working since she was 9, and in all those years, she had never once let anyone see her defeated. The day of the invitation, she had been crouching behind Lady Genevieve's carriage, trying to retrieve the spool of gold thread that had rolled beneath the wheel. She had been hired to repair the trim on Lady Genevieve's reception gown for a sum that barely covered her candles for the week. She had not spoken. She had simply worked, silent and invisible, the way servants are supposed to be in the world of the aristocracy. And then the card landed in front of her. "Oh, how sweet," Lady Genevieve said to the 2 women beside her. "She looks like she's bowing already. Perhaps she'll attend the Duke's ball. The theme is grand opulence." She laughed again. "Maybe she'll sew herself a gown from those scraps she steals." That word. Steals. Elara had never stolen anything in her life. Every remnant of fine fabric she owned had been purchased with her own earnings, piece by piece, yard by yard, saved from commissions that barely fed her, gathered over years with the patience of someone who believes that someday the right moment will come. She had been waiting for that moment for 15 years. She picked up the card. She read it. The Grand Duke's birthday celebration, the most exclusive event of the Highgate social season. Dress. Formal. Date. 9 days away. 9 days. She had enough fabric. She had the skill. And now she had a reason. Back in her room that night, Aara lit every candle she owned and sat down at her workbench. She pulled out the trunk from beneath her bed. Not the patched wool coat, not the mended boots. The other trunk, the cedar one with the brass lock, the one she had carried from her childhood home after the fire, the one thing she had saved. She opened it slowly. Inside, beneath years of tissue paper, were her father's things, architectural blueprints, rolled and tied with string, pages of his precise handwriting, and at the very bottom folded in linen pieces of fabric so fine they seemed to hold light inside them. Remnants she had saved, 1 yard at a time, from every commission that had passed through her hands. Silk the color of midnight. Velvet the shade of deep water. Thread real gold thread that she had bought a spool at a time, for years, with no plan except the quiet certainty that she was saving it for something worthy. Aara ran her fingers across the fabric and said nothing for a long time. Then she picked up her shears. She did not sleep for 3 nights. Not because she could not sleep, but because sleeping felt like wasted time. Every hour mattered now. Every stitch had to be perfect. Not beautiful in the way the aristocracy called things beautiful, all excess and volume and borrowed opulence, but beautiful in the truest way. The way a thing is beautiful when every part of it serves its purpose exactly. Aara cut by candlelight. She stitched the morning light. She pressed seams against the hot plate she borrowed from the cobbler's wife downstairs, who asked no questions and only brought her tea twice a day without being asked. The gown took shape slowly, the way all real things do. It was not what anyone would expect. It was not the gown of a woman trying to look wealthy. It was the gown of a woman who had stopped caring what other people thought and started caring, deeply and completely, about truth. The base was midnight silk, not shiny, not loud, but deep, with a quality that swallowed light and gave back only depth. The bodice was structured, precise, fitted without a single wasted seam, the kind of tailoring that only someone who had spent years understanding the architecture of fabric could achieve. And then, the detail that would change everything. Along the hem and cuffs, she stitched a pattern. Not flowers, not vines, not the usual decorative motifs of the season. She stitched the floor plans, the blueprints from her father's trunk, the ones he had drawn before he died. The detailed architectural plans of the Grand Duke's estate included, mapped in thread so fine it looked like embroidery from a distance, but was unmistakably precise up close, the location of the estate's private vaults. Her father had designed those vaults. He had built them, and then he had been found dead 2 weeks after the foundations were laid, ruled an accident by the same magistrate who sat on the Duke's payroll. Aara had been 9 years old. She had understood nothing then. She understood everything now. On the 4th night, she heard a noise below her window. Not an unusual noise for Threadneedle Alley, but this one was wrong. Too quiet, too careful. She crossed to the window and looked down. A man was huddled in the archway across the street, half hidden by shadow, wrapped in a coat so worn it barely counted as a coat. But something about his stillness caught her attention. He wasn't begging. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the alley with a focused, deliberate attention that didn't belong to someone merely passing through. Aara watched him for a moment. Then she went downstairs, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the street. "You're going to freeze to death in that archway," she said, without introduction or apology. The man looked up. He was perhaps 30, with dark, sharp eyes and a face that had once been well-fed and had since become something leaner and harder. There was a quality to his bearing even beneath the rags, something in how he held his spine that didn't match the costume of poverty he wore. "I've survived colder," he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. His name, he told her, was Julian. Just Julian. No family name offered. He had been living in the city for 3 years, working the archive rooms of the Public Records Hall when they let him, and sleeping rough when they didn't. He was careful with his words, deliberate in a way that felt like the speech of a man who had learned that saying too much could get you killed. Elara brought him upstairs. She gave him the bread she had been saving for tomorrow, and watched him eat it slowly, with more dignity than hunger usually allows. She didn't ask questions. She recognized the shape of a man holding a secret she had been holding one herself for 15 years. Before he left, he looked at the gown on the dressmaker's form in the center of her room. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at her with something different in his eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, but a recognition. The way you look at someone when you realize you are not as alone as you thought. "You're going to the Duke's ball," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "So am I." She raised an eyebrow. "I'll need a coat," he added. "Something that makes me look like I belong." "I can make that happen," she said. "But first, you'll need to tell me the truth about who you are." Julian was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cart passed. A dog barked twice and fell silent. "Later," he said. "Some truths take time to trust." She understood that perfectly. Over the 5 days that followed, Julian came every evening. He would sit in the corner with a cup of whatever Aara had brewing, usually something thin that called itself tea, and he would watch her work. He never interfered. He never offered empty praise. He simply watched with the focused, appreciating silence of someone who understood craft. On the second evening, he brought her something, a folder of papers, sealed in oilcloth. He placed it on the table beside her shears without ceremony. "What is this?" she asked. "Evidence," he said. "The kind that doesn't exist in any official record because someone made sure it disappeared. But not everything disappears completely, if you know where the archives are buried." Aara opened the folder. Inside were pages of financial records, transactions, dates, and names. And one document she recognized immediately, because she had been searching for it since she was old enough to know what to search for. The original contract between her father, architect Emil Voss, and the Duke's estate, signed, dated, and annotated, in a handwriting that was not her father's, with notes that described what should happen to him once the vault designs were delivered. She had to read the page twice before she understood what she was looking at. The Duke had commissioned her father. The Duke had received the designs. And then the Duke had arranged for him to be silenced. What happened to Emil Voss was not an accident. It had never been an accident. Aara set the paper down. She was very still for a moment. Her blue eyes were dry. She had cried all the tears she had for this, the night after her father died, in a burned house with nothing left but a cedar trunk and her own 2 hands. She had no more tears for it, only clarity. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I lived in those archives for 3 years," Julian said. "I wasn't there by accident." "Then who are you, Julian?" The truth this time. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, those hands that were too careful, too deliberate, that held a cup of thin tea with the same precision a man uses when he has spent his life holding fragile things. "My name is Julian Ashworth," he said finally. "The Duke is my uncle. And 6 years ago, he had me declared dead so he could take control of the estate's title and assets. The estate by right of inheritance belongs to me." The room was very quiet. Outside, rain had begun. It came down soft and steady, the way rain does in the middle of the night when the city is almost asleep, and the things you don't want to hear have nowhere to hide. "Ashworth," Aara said slowly. "Lady Genevieve is my cousin," Julian said, "and she knows exactly what her father did. She has known for years." Aara looked at the folder on the table. Then she looked at the gown on the dressmaker's form, the midnight silk, the gold thread. The vault plans stitched into the hem with a needle, fine enough to thread starlight. The picture became whole suddenly, all the pieces moving without her knowing they were moving, now locking into place. It was not just a ball, it was a reckoning. She stood and crossed to the small window. Below, the rain made rivers in the mud of Threadneedle Alley. She thought about her father, bent over his drafting table by lamplight, drawing plans with the careful love of a man who believed his work would build something lasting. She thought about a 9-year-old girl watching smoke rise from the only home she'd ever known. She turned back to Julian. "You have the documents," she said. "I have the proof, stitched into something they won't be able to ignore. And we both have a reason to walk through that door." She paused. "So we go together." Julian looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but close. The thing that happens when you have been carrying something alone for too long, and someone finally offers to help carry it. "Together," he said. The night of the ball arrived in the way great nights always do, quietly at first, and then all at once. Aara had spent the final day in complete stillness. No last-minute alterations, no nervous second-guessing. The gown was finished. It was perfect. She had learned long ago that the moment you start doubting a finished thing, you ruin it. She washed her hair with the last of the rosemary she'd been saving, combed it through until it shone, and put it up herself, not the simple knot she wore to work, but something else, something she had been practicing in the small cracked mirror above her wash basin, night after night, for as long as she had known this night was coming. Coiled braids, secured with pins that had belonged to her mother, with 2 loose pieces framing her face, just so. It looked expensive. It was not expensive. It was a skill. She dressed slowly. The midnight silk settled around her, like water finding its level exactly right, in a way that made her breath catch for just a moment, before she steadied herself. The bodice fit as though it had grown from her body. The hem fell exactly where she had planned. The bioluminescent thread, treated with a phosphorescent compound she had extracted from lamp oil and dried carefully over weeks, catching the candlelight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to breathe. She put on her mother's earrings, pearl drops, simple and small. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror for a long time. She did not look like the seamstress from Threadneedle Alley. She did not look like someone's charity case. She did not look like a joke. She looked like a woman with something to say. Julian was waiting downstairs. She had altered his coat over the past 3 days, restructured the shoulders, replaced the buttons with ones she had polished to a high shine, pressed the lapels until they held a clean, sharp line. He had shaved and cut his hair, and for the first time she could see the man beneath the years of rough living, the strong jaw, the careful posture, the dark eyes that held a depth she had been reading in pieces and now saw whole. He looked at her when she came down the stairs. He didn't speak for a moment. "Well," he said finally. "Don't," she said. "I was only going to say, I know what you were going to say. Save it for the ballroom. We have work to do." But she saw the corner of his mouth move, and she didn't hate the feeling that caused in her chest, something warm and inconvenient that she filed away to examine later, when there was time. There was no time tonight. The carriage they hired was modest, a hired coach, nothing grand. But when it arrived at the gates of the Duke's estate, and the footman came to open the door, what stepped out of it made him pause. Not because of the dress, exactly, though the dress stopped breathing, because of how she moved, how she held herself, how she looked at the lit-up facade of the estate, the one that had been built on her father's blueprints, and her father's death, with eyes that held nothing fearful and nothing servile, and nothing that resembled the expression of someone who thought they didn't belong. She walked through those gates, as though she had always intended to. Julian fell into step beside her, his hand offered at her elbow not possessively, not with show, but steadily, as though he understood that tonight, They were each other's anchor. She took his arm. The Grand Duke's ballroom was everything Threadneedle Alley was not. It was high-ceilinged and warm, lit by chandeliers that held more candles than Elara's entire building had seen in a year. The walls were paneled in gilded wood. The floors were polished so bright they reflected the dancers like a second world below. Orchestral music moved through the room, with the smoothness of something expensive and old, the kind of music that expects to be heard and appreciated without effort. Every woman in the room wore silk. Every man wore a pressed coat with a clean cravat. Jewels caught light at necks and wrists and fingers, and the combined effect was of a world constructed entirely for the purpose of being admired. Aara had expected to feel small when she walked in. She didn't. What she felt was clarity. The same clarity she felt when she was stitching the final edge of a perfect seam. The sensation of everything unnecessary falling away, and only the essential remaining. She announced at the top of the stairs she had given a name, a borrowed title, something unremarkable that the herald read without recognition, and she began to descend. The first person who noticed her was a woman in red, whose eyes caught on Elara's gown and stayed there a moment too long, her conversation faltering mid-sentence. Then a man nearby turned. Then another. It moved through the room the way fire moves through dry grass, not with noise, but with a steady, unstoppable progression that, once begun, could not be called back. The murmuring started at the edges and moved inward, not because the dress was flashy. It was not flashy. Not because she was loud or performing, she was neither, but because there was something about her presence in that room that refused to be dismissed. And people felt it before they understood it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. She reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the ballroom floor. And that was when Lady Genevieve Ashworth saw her. Lady Genevieve was standing with a cluster of women near the champagne table, her blonde hair perfectly set, her sky-blue gown layered and precise, her expression carrying the permanent, mild superiority of someone who has never questioned their right to occupy the best spaces in every room. She was beautiful, the way expensive things are beautiful, immaculate, constructed, and cold. She turned when the murmuring reached her. She found Aara, and Aara watched with great, quiet satisfaction as the recognition arrived on Lady Genevieve's face, and what it cost her to contain it, because Lady Genevieve had expected to see a seamstress in a desperate attempt, something to point at and laugh about, something to confirm what she already believed about the natural order of things. She had not expected this. "Is that?" one of Lady Genevieve's companions began. "No," Lady Genevieve said quickly, cutting her off. "Excuse me." She moved through the crowd with purpose. Aara saw her coming and did not change direction. She moved toward the center of the room at her own pace, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray with the ease of someone for whom this was entirely normal, and waited. Lady Genevieve reached her near the edge of the dance floor, and to her credit, she kept her voice low. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Lady Genevieve said, "but this is not an invitation to be taken seriously. You are a seamstress. You mend hems. You do not attend events like this." Aara looked at her calmly. "And yet here I am," Aara said simply. Lady Genevieve's jaw tightened. She looked at the gown, and really looked at it, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not the dismissal she had expected to feel. Something else. Something uncomfortable. "Where did you get that fabric?" she asked, despite herself. "I made it," Aara said. "I've been making it for 15 years. You're lying. You couldn't possibly." "I stitched every inch of it myself," Aara said, "including the embroidery at the hem. Do look closely, Lady Genevieve, if you have the chance. I think you'll find it quite interesting." Lady Genevieve looked down at the hem. From where she stood, it looked like decorative embroidery, intricate, admittedly stunning, but decorative. She couldn't make out the pattern in the candlelight. She straightened, reassembling her composure. "This little stunt ends tonight," Lady Genevieve said. Enjoy your champagne, while you still can." She turned and walked away. Aara watched her go, then turned to find Julian at her elbow. "She's going to try something," Julian said quietly. "I know. She's going to try to spill something on me." "How can you possibly?" "Because it's what I would do, if I were petty and frightened, and out of better options." Aara glanced toward the champagne table, where Lady Genevieve was now speaking very quietly to one of her companions. "Watch the right side. She'll use a proxy." Julian watched. Aara positioned herself just slightly to the left of where she had been standing, a movement that looked natural, casual, the ordinary drift of someone moving through a social gathering. 3 minutes later, a young woman Aara had never seen before moved through the crowd toward her, with a glass held at an angle that made no physical sense unless she intended to spill it. Aara stepped forward, not back, forward, and smoothly turned as though to greet someone, and the young woman's outstretched glass caught nothing but air. The momentum of the would-be spill carried her forward, and she stumbled, champagne splashing across the front of her own gown, and the small cluster of guests nearest them turned to look. Lady Genevieve, watching from 20 feet away, had to compose her expression with visible effort. Later, a gentleman asked Aara to dance. She accepted, because refusing would have been conspicuous, and because she moved through the waltz with the same careful attention she brought to everything, precisely, gracefully, with complete control of every small decision her body made. He was a pleasant man, a minor lord from the North Provinces, who complimented her dress and asked her name, and talked about the summer weather with the particular earnestness of a man who has nothing to hide and finds that comfortable. She answered him warmly and listened with genuine attention, because she had not come here to be cruel to people who were merely ordinary. Over his shoulder, she watched Julian slip away from the ballroom toward the east corridor. The vault was in the east wing. It was time. Julian moved through the east corridor with the particular confidence of someone who belongs somewhere. He had learned that, years ago, before everything. When you are born into a house, you absorb it. The lengths of corridors, the weight of certain doors, the way sound travels differently near the servants' stairs. He had played in these halls as a child. He had explored them the way children explore the only world they know, before they understand the world has borders. He had been 24 when his uncle decided he was a problem. He had been declared dead within the month following a riding accident, witnessed by 2 men on the Duke's payroll, documented by a magistrate who had been receiving regular payments from the estate. Julian had spent the years since moving like a ghost through the margins of the city, gathering what evidence he could, building the case that would restore what was rightfully his. Tonight, he had the last piece to retrieve. The Duke's study was on the 2nd floor, east wing, 3rd door from the landing. Julian knew because he had stood in that room countless times as a boy, watching his father conduct business. He moved up the servants' stairs, avoided the 2 footmen stationed at the main corridor, and reached the study door without incident. Inside, the room smelled of paper and old wood, and something underneath both that Julian recognized as anxiety, the particular sharp smell of a man who has been managing secrets for too long. The desk was near the window. Julian crossed to it, opened the 2nd drawer on the left, and found exactly what he was looking for. The original deed of the estate transferred the document that had legally moved the estate's title from Julian's name to his uncle's, based on the false death certificate, and beside it, the sealed letter that Julian had known existed and had been searching for 3 years, a private correspondence between the Duke and the magistrate, discussing what to do about the architect who had built the vaults and therefore knew too much. Emil Voss, Elara's father. Julian stood very still for a moment, holding those papers in the dark study. He thought about the woman in the ballroom below the one in the midnight gown, with the vault plans stitched into her hem, who had grown up without her father and spent 15 years building toward this night, without knowing that the man she had sheltered in her archway was the other half of this story. He folded the documents carefully inside his coat. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. He pressed himself into the shadow behind the door as the footsteps stopped outside. A pause. Then the handle turned. The Grand Duke himself stepped into the study. He was an imposing man, broad-shouldered, dressed in heavy dark formal wear, his expression severe, with the particular anxiety of someone who has just realized something is wrong, but hasn't yet located what. He went directly to the desk, opened the second drawer on the left. His hands went still. He looked at the empty drawer for a long moment. Then he looked up and around the room with the slow deliberateness of a man whose mind is recalculating everything. Julian was already moving toward the window. The Duke turned. "Who's there?" the Duke said sharply. But Julian was already through the window, catching the ledge, dropping to the garden below with the practiced ease of 3 years of rough living. He landed softly in the flower bed, straightened, adjusted his coat. Above him, the study window lit up. The Duke's silhouette appeared. Julian walked calmly toward the servants' entrance that led back toward the ballroom. He had what he needed. Now they needed the stage. The Duke re-entered the ballroom from the east corridor, 14 minutes after Julian returned to Elara's side. She felt the change in the room before she saw him, a tightening in the air, a small recession of noise from the far end, the way a gathering shifts when the person with the most power in it becomes anxious. Julian pressed something into her hand, folded documents, warm from being held close. "You got them," she said quietly. "He knows something is missing. He'll move quickly. Then we move first." She looked across the room. Lady Genevieve had materialized at the Duke's side, speaking quietly, her hand on his arm, her eyes already scanning the room. They landed on Aara. Lady Genevieve said something to her father. The Duke's gaze moved to Aara with the slow, recognizing turn of a man who had just been told which direction the danger was coming from. And then he began walking toward her. He was not alone. 2 men in dark formal wear followed at a respectful distance, but they were walking the way bodyguards walk, not guests. Aara looked at Julian. "Now?" he asked. "Now," she said. She moved toward the base of the grand staircase. The staircase that curved up from the ballroom floor to the mezzanine above the same staircase down which the evening's guests had descended. Each announced, each positioned as if on a stage. She had chosen it from the moment she arrived. She had been waiting for this. She moved past groups of guests who turned as she passed, because she was moving with a purpose that drew the eye the way weather does something building, something gathering. Lady Genevieve saw her heading for the stairs and understood. She began moving too from the other direction, cutting through the crowd with sharp, elegant urgency. She reached the base of the stairs first. She turned to face the room, positioning herself to intercept. "I don't think so," Lady Genevieve said, her voice low and controlled. "You threw that invitation at my feet," Aara said, equally low. "You wanted an audience tonight. You're about to get one. You have no idea what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. I've known for 15 years. I was just waiting for the right room." The orchestra had been slowing not because anyone directed them to, but because musicians are sensitive to the temperature of a room, and this room's temperature had changed. The last notes of the waltz faded. In the relative quiet, conversations faltered. People began to look. The Duke arrived at Lady Genevieve's side. Up close, he was what the image in Elara's mind had always suggested. He would be a man whose power was real, but whose confidence in it had been corroding for some time. His eyes moved between Aara and Julian with a calculating speed. "You need to leave," the Duke said. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "You had my father killed," Aara said. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 200 people holding their breath simultaneously. Aara walked up 3 steps. She turned to face the room. She had chosen these 3 steps with the instinct of a woman who had spent her life working with structure and proportion. 3 steps up, she was above the crowd by enough to be seen clearly by every person in the room. The candlelight of the chandelier above caught her gown, and the bioluminescent threads in her hem began to glow softly, deeply, like something alive, and the intricate pattern that had looked like embroidery from a distance was now visible, from this angle and in this light, for what it was. Floor plans. The precise architectural maps of the Duke's estate, including the private vaults, stitched in threads so fine they read like an engineer's drafting, not a seamstress's decoration. People near the front of the crowd began to lean in. I began to squint, began to recognize. Aara held up the documents Julian had placed in her hand. "My name is Aara Voss," she said. Her voice was clear and carried without being raised. "My father was Emil Voss, the architect who designed this estate's private vaults 16 years ago. 2 weeks after he delivered the completed plans, he was killed. The death was ruled an accident." "It was not an accident." She held up the sealed letter. "This is a private correspondence between the Duke and the magistrate who filed the ruling. It describes, in their own words, what was decided and why. My father knew too much. He had built the vaults, he understood where the assets were hidden, and he had begun to suspect that those assets included wealth that had been illegally transferred from a trust belonging to someone else." She looked at Julian, who had moved to stand at the base of the stairs. "That someone else," Aara said, "is Julian Ashworth, the true heir to this estate, whom you will find listed in the original deed of inheritance which I also hold, was declared dead 6 years ago by this same magistrate, in this same pattern, by the same method." The room had not moved. 200 people stood, as though the air had thickened around them. The orchestra had put down their instruments. Somewhere near the back, someone made a sharp, small noise. The Duke had gone the particular grey of a man who understands, in one instant, that the ground beneath everything he has built has just been removed. Lady Genevieve was absolutely still. Her composure, that immaculate, glacial composure, had cracked along an invisible line, and what was visible through the crack was not rage but something more honest and more terrible. Fear. The Duke moved toward the stairs. "These are forgeries," he said. His voice was almost steady. "She is a seamstress with a grievance and a talent for theatre." "Then let the court examine them," Julian said from the base of the stairs. He stepped forward into the clear space the crowd had created. "Let the court examine the handwriting, the seal, the dates. Let the court speak to the magistrate. Let the court read the original death certificate and compare it to the records I have gathered over 3 years in the city's archives." He looked directly at his uncle. "I'm not asking for your confession. I'm telling you that by tomorrow morning, every record I hold will be in the hands of the city's judicial council. Tonight is not the trial. Tonight is only the announcement." The Duke looked at him, and for the first time in Julian Ashworth's memory, his uncle looked small. Around them, the crowd had begun to move not away, but to talk. In low, urgent clusters, 2 men near the door had already left with the particular hurry of people who wanted to be somewhere else before things became official. The remaining guests shifted and murmured with the electric energy of people present at a moment they know they will be describing for years. Lady Genevieve turned to her father. Her voice was very quiet. "Father," she said. But there was nothing he could say to her. His expression said everything his voice would not. The complicated, exhausted acknowledgement of a man who has spent years holding a structure together that was never sound and has just watched the last beam give way. Aara descended the 3 steps. She walked to Julian. He turned to her, and she saw in his face something she recognized, the particular expression of a person who has been fighting a long, quiet battle alone and has just, finally, won. She thought about her father, about his blueprint books and his careful handwriting, and the way he used to hum when he worked, a low, tuneless sound that she had not heard in 15 years and could still reproduce exactly inside her own mind. She had done what she came to do. Julian looked at her for a moment, then he offered his hand, not a dramatic gesture, nothing theatrical, simply offered it, quietly, between the two of them. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "There's still a great deal of work to do, I know." He held her gaze. "But I'd rather do a great deal of work with someone beside me than do none of it alone." Something moved in her chest, warm and inconvenient, and no longer something she could file away for later. She took his hand. They walked out of the Grand Duke's estate together, not hurrying, not hiding. Through the front door, past the footman who stepped aside without instruction, down the stone steps, through the iron gates, out onto the lamp-lit street, where the hired coach waited exactly where they had left it. Behind them, through the tall lit windows, the shapes of the ballroom guests were still visible, talking, gesturing, a world mid-collapse, trying to remember how to stand. Aara did not look back. The legal proceedings took 4 months. The Duke's assets were frozen within 3 days of the Judicial Council receiving Julian's documents. The magistrate, confronted with the correspondence, resigned his post before he could be formally charged. Lady Genevieve, stripped of her social position and much of her income as the estate's finances unraveled, relocated to the north. No one heard much from her after that. Julian was formally recognized as the rightful heir to the Ashworth estate by the city's highest court in the spring. He was 31 years old, and he had spent 6 years living on the margins of everything that should have been his. He received it back with an equanimity that surprised people who expected triumph, and found instead a man who seemed more interested in what came next than in what had been restored. What came next, for him, was Aara. They did not rush it. After years of waiting and working and carrying things alone, neither of them had any desire to hurry what was good. They spent the months of the legal proceedings working, Julian managing the restoration of the estate's finances, Aara establishing what she had always been building toward, a proper workshop, in a real space, with real light and real tools, and the freedom to take only the work that interested her and do it the way it deserved to be done. She hired 2 young women from Threadneedle Alley. She paid them properly. She kept the cedar trunk, the blueprints, the fabric remnants, the things that had made the journey from the burned house to this new place. She kept them all, not as relics of grief, but as evidence of what endures. On the last evening before the court issued its final ruling, Julian came to her workshop. She was at the workbench, finishing the hem of something that had nothing to do with justice or revenge, just a beautiful thing she was making, because it pleased her to make it. He sat in the corner where he had always sat, with whatever she had brewing, and watched her work. After a while, she looked up. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm happy," he said, as though it surprised him. "That's different from quiet. For me, they feel similar. I don't have a great deal of experience with it." She set down her needle. "Julian." "Yes." "Come here." He crossed the room. She stood, and they were close, the way they had been close several times in the past months, and had each, separately, decided that the moment wasn't right yet. The moment was right now. They both felt it. He tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back behind her ear, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, and she looked up at him with those blue eyes that had always read people like pages, and she read him now. What she read was certain. He kissed her, not with the urgency of something long delayed finally releasing, though it was that, but with the quiet warmth of something real, something built from trust and shared weight, and the particular intimacy of having faced the truth beside someone, and not been diminished by what you found there. She kissed him back. Outside, the lamps of the city glowed in the spring dark. Below the workshop, somewhere on the street that was not Threadneedle Alley, but a better, wider street, life moved at its ordinary pace, Merchants closing, children calling home, the city settling into night. Inside, two people held each other in the quiet and let the long, difficult work of the years just past be something that had happened and been survived and, in its strange, cruel way, led them here. There are things this story asks you to hold with you, long after the last chapter. The first is this: dignity is not given to you. It cannot be granted by the people above you, or stripped by the people who look down on you. It lives in how you carry yourself when no one is watching, how you work, how you treat others, how you respond to cruelty without becoming cruel. Aara had nothing by the world's accounting. She had everything by the only accounting that actually matters. The second is this: patience is not weakness. Aara waited 15 years, not because she was passive, but because she understood that a thing worth doing must be done completely, and completely takes time. She gathered, and learned, and preserved, and prepared, and when the moment came, she was ready, in a way that rushing could never have made her. The third is this: the people who mock you are not seeing you. They are seeing a story they have already decided about you, based on what you're wearing, or where you live, or what your pockets hold. Lady Genevieve saw a seamstress. She did not see a woman whose father built the very walls she lived inside. She did not see the 15 years of work. She did not see the intelligence, the precision, the patience, the fire. The cruelest mistake you can make is to accept other people's incomplete vision of you as the truth. And the fourth, perhaps the most quietly important: you do not have to carry everything alone. Julian carried his burden alone for 6 years. Aara carried hers for 15. What changed everything for both of them was not the documents, or the gown, or the ballroom. It was the decision, made by each of them in a small room on a rainy night, to trust. That is always the hardest part. That is always the part that changes everything. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.